They were just kids, honor roll students, football players, the quiet ones in the back of the class, the ones you'd pass in the hallway without a second thought. Their childhood photos, frozen in time, tell a different story. Smiling faces, birthday parties, the kind of memories that should belong to a life that never strayed from the path. But something happened, something that transformed them from ordinary teenagers into names whispered in fear. Their crimes shocked their families, stunned entire communities, and made headlines across the country. The neighbors who had once waved to them from across the street could no longer reconcile the boy they'd seen riding his bike with the face on the evening news. Teachers who had graded their homework with little more than passing curiosity now found themselves combing through old essays and class notes, searching for some missed sign, some overlooked warning. Because there had to be something. Violence like this doesn't just appear out of nowhere, does it? One day, they were walking the halls of their high schools, their biggest concern a pop quiz or a football tryout. The next, they were being led out of those same schools in handcuffs, the flashing lights of police cars bouncing off their faces, faces that still looked so young, so unassuming. Some of them barely old enough to drive. Some of them too young to even fully understand the weight of what they had done. But when the cameras rolled, when the crime scene tape went up, when the evidence was laid out in court, the world was left with no choice but to ask, what drives a child to kill? Was it something buried deep within them, waiting for the right moment to surface? A quiet anger, a festering rage, a darkness they had spent years concealing behind polite smiles and childhood innocence? Or was it something else? Something external? A push too far, a moment of blind fury, an impulse they could never take back. Each case is different, yet disturbingly similar. Some planned their crimes in chilling detail, mapping out every step, every alibi, every loose end. Others acted on instinct, a fleeting decision that shattered lives in an instant. And yet, whether it was weeks of meticulous planning or a single uncontrollable moment, the result was always the same. The line between innocence and guilt, between childhood and something far more dangerous, had been crossed. Tonight, we go beyond the headlines, beyond the mugshots, beyond the courtroom testimonies. We revisit the crime scenes, retrace their steps, and hear from those who were there: police officers, investigators, forensic psychologists, and the families left shattered in the aftermath. We will hear from the parents who never saw it coming, the friends who can't believe what happened, the detectives who pieced together the horrifying truth. And in some cases, we will hear from the killers themselves. Their words, their confessions, their explanations, some chillingly remorseless, others heavy with regret. These are not just stories of violence. They are stories of deception, of manipulation, of choices that led to unthinkable consequences. The courtroom doors will open, the evidence will be laid bare. And at the center of it all, young faces, youthful innocence twisted into something unrecognizable. Some of them were sentenced to die. Others will spend the rest of their lives behind bars. But before the sentences, before the trials, before the crimes themselves, there were warning signs. Moments that, in hindsight, seemed to spell out exactly what was coming. A diary entry scrawled in the margins of a school notebook. A text message sent late at night, cryptic and unsettling. A quiet confession to a friend that was brushed off as a joke. Hindsight is always sharpest when it's too late. From the chilling 911 call that shattered a quiet neighborhood to the final moments in court when the gavel came down. This is America's most dangerous young killers, sentenced to death and life behind bars. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where children rode their bikes until sunset, where front doors remained unlocked, and where parents felt safe letting their kids play outside without a second thought. It was a Florida suburb like so many others, ordinary, uneventful. The kind of place where something like this should never have happened. But it did. It began with a missing child. November 3rd, 1998. Jacksonville, Florida. 8-year-old Maddie Clifton was last seen around 5 p.m., playing outside her home on a warm autumn evening. She was the kind of child who never met a stranger, bright, friendly, full of energy. That afternoon, she was knocking on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone wanted to come out and play. One of those doors belonged to 14-year-old Joshua Phillips. He was, by all accounts, an average kid. A quiet boy with a round face and dark hair, he lived just down the street from Maddie with his parents. His father, a disciplinarian with a strict set of rules, was known to have a temper. His mother, by contrast, was warm and doting. To most people who knew Joshua, he was shy but polite. The kind of kid you wouldn't look twice at in a crowd, but behind the walls of his home, something else lurked. That night, when Maddie never returned home, the neighborhood sprang into action. Her parents, frantic, called the police. Officers canvassed the area. Volunteers combed the streets, flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. Flyers were printed, her face staring back in black and white. But no one found Maddie. For an entire week, the community searched, door to door, yard to yard, every crevice, every corner. The case made headlines, news anchors delivering updates as the hours turned into days, but there were no clues, no witnesses, no sign of where an 8-year-old girl could have gone. Until the smell. 7 days after Maddie disappeared, Joshua's mother was tidying his room when she noticed something strange. A leak, it seemed, coming from beneath his bed, a damp patch spreading across the floor. She bent down curious. Then she saw it. A sock, a small child's sock, protruding from under the wooden bed frame. And the smell, sickly, unmistakable. What happened next would change everything. She lifted the bed skirt, and there, hidden inside the base of the waterbed, was Maddie Clifton's lifeless body. Joshua's mother ran from the room, her screams cutting through the walls of their home. Moments later, the call was made. Police arrived in force, blue and red lights flashing across the street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, their breath caught in their throats. Joshua, the quiet boy from down the street, had been living with Maddie's body just inches from where he slept. But how did she get there? At first, Joshua's explanation was simple. It was an accident, he claimed. A game gone wrong. He said Maddie had come over to play baseball, and in a moment of miscalculated force, he had struck her in the eye with the ball. Panicked, knowing his father would be furious, he dragged her into his house. When she wouldn't stop crying, wouldn't stop screaming, he did the only thing he could think of to silence her. With a bat, with a knife, with a force no child should ever be capable of. But the evidence told a different story. Investigators found Maddie's body contorted within the bed frame, her injuries far more brutal than a simple accident could explain. Stab wounds, blunt force trauma, signs of a prolonged struggle. The truth was far more horrifying than Joshua's calm recounting of events. For days, he had slept just inches away from the body, living a normal life while the entire town searched for the girl he knew was already gone. He had even joined the search efforts, standing alongside neighbors as they called Maddie's name into the empty night. Now, the quiet boy with the round face wasn't just a neighbor. He was a suspect. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, spectators, Maddie's family, their faces etched with grief. Joshua's mother, her hands shaking in her lap. 14 years old, yet standing trial as an adult. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of premeditation, of intent. The defense, in turn, pleaded for leniency. He was just a boy, they argued. But the crime was too brutal, the evidence too damning. The verdict came swiftly. First-degree murder, a life sentence, no parole. Joshua Phillips, a boy barely old enough to have a learner's permit, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The gavel came down. The courtroom exhaled. And a mother walked away from her son, knowing she would never again see him outside the walls of a prison. Outside, reporters delivered the final update. The story had an ending now. The neighborhood, once shattered, would begin to heal. But behind closed doors, behind the bars of a cell, a boy who once played baseball in the Florida sun now faced a lifetime of nights that never ended. And the world was left to ask, what makes a child capable of something like this? This was just the beginning. It was around 5 p.m. on November 3rd, 1998, when 8-year-old Maddie Clifton left her house. She was full of energy, bouncing between houses, knocking on doors, looking for someone to play with. Joshua Phillips, 14 years old, was home alone at the time. His father was still at work. His mother had left the house. It was just him. At some point, Maddie made her way to Joshua's house, a few doors down from her own. What happened next is known only from Joshua's own account, a version of events that would later be scrutinized, dissected, and questioned at every turn. According to Joshua, Maddie had asked if he wanted to play baseball. The two went into his backyard, where he picked up a ball and a bat. A simple game, no different from the dozens they had likely played before. But in the span of just a few moments, everything changed. Joshua later claimed that while swinging the bat, he accidentally hit Maddie in the eye. She screamed. She started crying. And that's when, according to him, panic set in. At first, there was no plan, no clear motive, just a single moment of fear and then a series of actions that became increasingly more brutal, more horrifying, and more impossible to take back. Maddie was hurt. She was crying, and Joshua, terrified of what his father would do if he found out, made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of calling for help, instead of running for an adult, he grabbed her. She was still conscious when he dragged her into the house, through the back door, his hands trembling. He pulled her into his bedroom, the door slamming shut behind them. She was crying too loudly. He couldn't let anyone hear. What he did next was not an accident. Joshua retrieved a bat from his room, the same one he had allegedly hit her with outside, and began striking her, over and over. The blows landed with force, her small body absorbing the impact. Her cries turned into gasps, desperate, struggling breaths, but she was still alive. At some point, he grabbed a knife. The first stab came quickly, but it wasn't enough. She fought back. She was a child, barely half his size, but she fought, scratching, kicking, trying to escape. He stabbed her again, and again, and again. Even as she gasped for air, even as her body went limp, it wasn't over. Her tiny chest rose and fell, slow, shallow breaths. She was still alive. And that, Joshua later claimed, was what terrified him the most. Because if she was still alive, it meant this wasn't over. It meant someone would find out. It meant there was still a chance to be caught. The room was silent now. The only sound was Joshua's own breath, ragged and uneven. The reality of what he had done was sinking in, but there was no time to process it. His father would be home soon. He had to do something. The first thought that came to him was hiding her. He lifted the heavy frame of his waterbed. The mattress was filled with liquid, flexible enough to shift, soft enough to make space. It wasn't a perfect hiding place, but it was the only option he saw. He forced Maddie's small body inside the base of the bed, wedging her beneath the wooden frame, pushing her limbs into the confined space. Then, he wiped the blood from the floor, changed his clothes, and sat on his bed. Just feet away, her body remained hidden beneath him. His father came home. His mother moved about the house. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened. And Joshua, 14 years old, acted as if nothing had happened too. For an entire week, the town searched. Maddie's face was on posters, news broadcasts, the front page of the local newspaper. Police officers knocked on doors, asking questions, checking backyards, looking for anything that might lead to her whereabouts. And Joshua played along. He joined the search efforts. He stood among neighbors as they called out Maddie's name. He sat in his living room as his parents spoke to reporters about the missing little girl just a few houses down. Every night, he climbed into bed and slept just inches away from the secret he was hiding. But secrets don't stay buried forever. By the seventh day, the house smelled different. A strange odor had begun to seep through the air, something his mother couldn't ignore. It was the smell that gave him away. She was cleaning his room when she noticed the wet spot near the base of the bed, a strange leak coming from the water mattress. At first, she assumed it was nothing until she bent down and saw it. The sock. A small, child's sock, peeking out from beneath the frame. It didn't belong to Joshua. Her hands trembled as she lifted the bed skirt. And then, for the first time, she saw what had been hidden in her house for 7 days. Her scream pierced through the walls. Joshua's secret was no longer a secret. The call to 911 came almost immediately. The police arrived within minutes. A crime scene that had gone undetected for a full week was now the center of flashing lights and yellow tape. Officers moved quickly, securing the area, removing the bed frame, confirming the worst. Maddie Clifton was dead. The boy who had searched for her alongside his neighbors, the boy who had smiled in school hallways, the boy who had eaten dinner with his family night after night, knowing what was hidden beneath him, was the same boy who had taken her life. There were no tears when he was arrested, no visible signs of remorse, just the quiet acceptance of a boy who had crossed an unimaginable line. By the time he stepped into the back of a police car, the town of Jacksonville was no longer searching for a missing girl. They had found her, and they had found her killer. In the days following Maddie Clifton's discovery, the authorities were left to piece together what had happened. The lack of evidence in the neighborhood, the absence of any witnesses, and the secrecy with which Joshua had hidden Maddie's body created a mystery that only deepened with time. The critical breakthrough came when Joshua's mother, while cleaning his room, discovered the sock. It was this small, seemingly insignificant detail that set everything in motion. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a strange anomaly. But as soon as the officers began their search beneath the bed, the horrifying truth came to light. Maddie's body, carefully hidden in the base of the waterbed, was not just the discovery of a missing child. It was the moment that everything unraveled. Joshua Phillips was quickly brought in for questioning, his world collapsing under the weight of his secret. When detectives arrived at the house, Joshua was sitting quietly on his bed, his demeanor unshaken by the events. He answered their questions with a level of calm that was unsettling, as if the fact that Maddie's body was hidden in his home was just another detail in the drama of a missing child. They asked him where he had been that afternoon. He said he was home alone. He mentioned playing baseball with Maddie. At first, his story was one of confusion, as if he couldn't remember exactly what had happened. But as the detectives pressed him, asking more pointed questions, a new version of events emerged. Joshua began to speak more about the accident, how the baseball had struck Maddie's eye, how she had screamed, how he panicked. The confession was still too vague and the details were missing. But there was one thing Joshua couldn't hide: the fear in his eyes. It didn't take long for the police to realize that Joshua was hiding something. His story didn't make sense. The blood in his room, the way he had acted during the search, and, most importantly, his ability to keep his composure when speaking about Maddie's death, all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Joshua Phillips was hiding a darker truth. The investigation didn't stop there. As the police examined his home, they discovered a series of inconsistencies. Joshua had lied about several details, including the order of events and the weapons he had used. The autopsy revealed that Maddie's injuries were not consistent with an accident. There was blunt force trauma, stabbing wounds, and signs that she had struggled desperately for her life. But, perhaps most telling, was the fact that Maddie had been killed long before her body had been hidden. Joshua had known she was dead, and yet he kept her hidden in his room. Joshua Phillips had been living with the body of his victim for 7 full days. With the mounting evidence, Joshua's own words, and his strange calm under pressure, there was no way for him to deny the truth any longer. Joshua Phillips's trial began in 1999, just months after the discovery of Maddie's body. He was 15 years old at the time, yet he was charged as an adult due to the severity of the crime. The trial captivated the nation. A quiet, seemingly unremarkable boy had brutally killed an 8-year-old girl, hidden her body for days, and participated in the search for her, only to be caught after the chilling discovery beneath his bed. The courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and family members on both sides, their emotions running high. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a chilling picture of the crime. They described the gruesome details of Maddie's murder, the blunt force trauma, the stab wounds, the desperation of a young girl fighting for her life. They argued that the crime had been premeditated, that Joshua had planned Maddie's death, and that her suffering was intentional. Joshua Phillips, the prosecutor stated, chose not to seek help when Maddie cried out. Instead, he made the choice to silence her forever, with a bat, with a knife, with his own hands. The defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that Joshua was just a confused, frightened child who had acted in a moment of panic. They claimed that Joshua didn't fully understand the gravity of his actions, that he was overwhelmed by his fear of punishment, and that his violent behavior had been the result of a tragic accident gone horribly wrong. Defense attorneys highlighted Joshua's young age, his history of feeling overshadowed by his strict father, and his apparent desire for attention. They painted him as a troubled teen who, in a moment of extreme stress, had acted out violently, but not with the intention of murder. In an attempt to humanize Joshua, his defense team called upon family members and even friends who testified about his life before the crime, how he had been a shy, socially awkward child, how his parents were strict, how he had grown up in a home that never seemed to show him affection. But the prosecution didn't let this narrative distract from the reality of what had transpired. Witnesses recounted Joshua's actions in the days after the murder, his participation in the search for Maddie, his lack of emotional response, and his casual demeanor as the days passed. For the prosecution, these were the most damning moments, showing a level of detachment that couldn't be explained away by age or fear. The case wasn't about a troubled child. It was about a brutal, calculated act of violence, one that had been covered up with cold precision. After a lengthy trial, the jury deliberated for just under 2 days. In the end, Joshua Phillips was found guilty of first-degree murder, not by accident, but with intent and malice. The evidence, combined with his own actions before and after the crime, made it clear that he had deliberately planned and carried out Maddie's murder. Joshua Phillips, who had once been a quiet, shy boy, now stood before a judge facing the consequences of a life sentence. At just 15 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with mixed emotions. For Maddie's family, the sentence brought no closure. A life had been taken, and a life was now behind bars. But nothing could erase the pain of losing their daughter, their sister, their friend. For Joshua's family, the sentence was a heartbreaking end to their own nightmare. While they had hoped for a lesser sentence, they were now faced with the harsh reality of what Joshua had done. Joshua Phillips was escorted from the courtroom, his hands shackled, his face blank. The gavel fell, sealing his fate. The town of Jacksonville and the world were left to ponder the question that had haunted the trial from the beginning. What makes a child capable of something like this? In the weeks and months following the trial, the Clifton family struggled to cope with the aftermath of Maddie's brutal murder. Her parents, Steve and Chandra Clifton, were left shattered by the loss of their young daughter. Maddie had been their only child, a girl full of life and promise. They had never imagined that the suburban neighborhood they had settled into for its safety and simplicity could harbor such darkness. For Steve and Chandra, the courtroom proceedings had been a blur of emotions: anger, disbelief, heartache. But the sentence handed down to Joshua Phillips, life without the possibility of parole, did little to offer any real sense of justice. There was no closure. There was no bringing Maddie back. What they had hoped for most was a future for their daughter, a chance for her to grow into the woman she could have been. Instead, they were left with the reality that she would forever remain a child, her life stolen far too soon. When asked in interviews how they were coping, Steve Clifton said, "We'll never get Maddie back, but maybe this will stop something like this from happening again. We have to believe that." He and his wife began speaking publicly about the tragedy, trying to raise awareness about the impact of juvenile violence and the need for better intervention in troubled homes. But no matter how many speeches they made, no matter how many people they reached with their advocacy, the hole left in their lives would never be filled. The community in Jacksonville also struggled to reconcile the horror of what had happened. Joshua Phillips had been a quiet, even unremarkable kid in the eyes of many who lived near him. People remembered him as a shy, polite neighbor, someone who seemed to blend into the background. No one could comprehend that such a person could commit such an unthinkable crime. The impact on the community was deep and lasting. Parents became more cautious, taking fewer risks and keeping their children closer to home. The sense of safety that had once characterized the neighborhood was shattered, and many struggled with how to move on from the trauma. The Phillips family, too, became outcasts in the town. Joshua's parents were left to deal with the brutal reality that their son had not only destroyed the life of a child, but had also forever altered their own lives. They, too, were haunted by the question of what had gone so terribly wrong. Joshua Phillips's case, as horrific and tragic as it was, sparked a much larger national conversation about juvenile sentencing. His conviction, at just 15 years old, raised questions about how young offenders should be treated in the criminal justice system, especially when the crime involved extreme violence. The case was a point of contention for legal experts, lawmakers, and the public. On one side of the debate were those who believed that children should be held accountable for their actions, regardless of their age, especially when the crime was as brutal and premeditated as Maddie's murder. For many, the fact that Joshua Phillips had been able to plan and execute such an act, hiding the body and living with the secret for days, demonstrated a level of maturity and intent that was beyond the capacity of a typical adolescent. These people argued that Joshua's actions should be met with the harshest consequences to prevent future tragedies. But others took a different view, arguing that sentencing a juvenile to life without parole was both inhumane and unjust. These critics pointed to the fact that juveniles have developing brains and that their capacity for change is far greater than that of adults. There was growing evidence to suggest that children who commit violent acts often do so as a result of trauma, abuse, or a lack of support, and with the right rehabilitation, they could become productive members of society. The case drew attention to the increasing use of life sentences for juvenile offenders, a practice that had been on the rise in the United States in the years preceding Joshua's trial. Joshua's sentence was a stark example of how the system treated juveniles, especially those convicted of serious crimes, and it sparked legal challenges across the nation. In the years following the case, the U.S. Supreme Court would issue rulings that dramatically changed how juveniles were sentenced. In 2005, the court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that the death penalty for juveniles was unconstitutional, based on the argument that children are not as morally culpable as adults. This was followed by Graham v. Florida in 2010, which ruled that life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles convicted of non-homicide offenses were unconstitutional. Finally, in Miller v. Alabama, 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles convicted of homicide were also unconstitutional, opening the door for the possibility of parole for certain juvenile offenders. While Joshua Phillips's case did not directly impact these rulings, it certainly played a part in the growing awareness and debate surrounding juvenile justice. His life sentence was one of many high-profile cases that caused lawmakers and courts to reconsider how the criminal justice system should handle young offenders. Was it fair to treat a 15-year-old the same as an adult, especially when the crime was the result of such severe emotional or psychological distress? Could a child be rehabilitated? In 2012, Joshua Phillips's case was revisited by some legal scholars and experts, though his sentence was not overturned. The conversation, however, had evolved. The notion of second chances for juveniles began to take root in a system that had long been focused on retribution. There were those who believed that the severity of Joshua's crime meant he should never be released, but there were others who questioned whether the justice system was doing enough to support the rehabilitation of young offenders. Ultimately, the legacy of the Joshua Phillips case lies not just in the tragedy of Maddie's death, but in its impact on the national conversation about how to handle young criminals. While the debate about juvenile sentencing continues, and some believe that children like Joshua should never see the light of day outside of prison, others advocate for reform, rehabilitation, and the possibility of redemption, even for those who commit the most heinous of crimes. The impact of the case is still felt today. Families who have suffered from similar crimes continue to struggle with the emotional toll, while the legal system wrestles with how to balance justice and compassion in cases involving our young offenders. In the end, the story of Joshua Phillips and Maddie Clifton serves as both a chilling reminder of the capacity for violence in the most unexpected places and a call for reflection on how society treats its most vulnerable and its most dangerous. The cases we've explored, whether it's Joshua Phillips or other young individuals who have committed heinous crimes, highlight a chilling and often unsettling reality. Children, though often seen as innocent or incapable of evil, can also harbor violent tendencies. But what drives them to commit such acts? And how should the justice system respond when youth is involved? Joshua Phillips was just 14 when he murdered Maddie Clifton. At that age, the brain is still developing, decision-making skills are still forming, and impulse control is often lacking. Yet, in Joshua's case, the brutality of the crime, the calculated nature of his actions, and the way he lived with the secret for days suggested a disturbing level of maturity in how he approached the situation. This forces us to ask, should age be the deciding factor in whether a child is tried as an adult, or is the severity of the crime what should determine the sentence? These cases force us to grapple with a system that, for many years, treated young offenders the same way as adults, regardless of their emotional or psychological state. The tragedy of Maddie Clifton's death and the resulting justice for Joshua Phillips raised difficult questions about juvenile responsibility. We are left to consider whether a life sentence for someone as young as 14 is truly just, or if there's room in our legal system for reform, rehabilitation, and, potentially, redemption. In the case of Joshua, the question of his future, whether or not he will be able to change and, perhaps, one day re-enter society, is something that still lingers. Many argue that children who commit such violent acts should be given the opportunity for rehabilitation, that they should be treated with a focus on reform and a path forward, while others believe that some crimes are too severe for second chances. In any case, the complexities of dealing with young killers in the justice system have never been more apparent. Joshua Phillips's case, and others like it, has played a role in shaping the ongoing conversation about juvenile sentencing. The controversy surrounding the fairness of sentencing children to life without parole has led to notable changes in laws over the years, particularly in the way the justice system views and treats young offenders. While Joshua's case didn't directly lead to changes in the law, it occurred in the midst of a broader shift in the legal landscape concerning juvenile justice. In the early 2000s, following a string of high-profile cases involving juvenile murderers, the U.S. Supreme Court began to reconsider its stance on juvenile sentencing. The landmark cases of Roper v. Simmons, 2005, Graham v. Florida, 2010, and Miller v. Alabama, 2012, all focused on the constitutional rights of juveniles and the potential for rehabilitation. The Roper case, for instance, ruled that the death penalty could not be applied to individuals who committed crimes before the age of 18. In Graham, the court declared that a sentence of life without parole for juveniles convicted of non-homicide offenses was unconstitutional. And in Miller, the court ruled that mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles convicted of homicide were unconstitutional, arguing that sentencing must take into account the individual circumstances and potential for reform in each case. These rulings have had far-reaching implications. They've made it clear that the justice system should treat juveniles differently from adults, not just because of their age, but because of the inherent differences in maturity and decision-making abilities. The emphasis on rehabilitation rather than solely on punishment marks a shift in how we view young offenders, opening up the possibility for parole or resentencing in some cases. While some may argue that these changes let dangerous criminals back into society, others believe these reforms offer a chance for young offenders to right the wrongs of their past and make amends. The question remains, how do we balance justice for the victims, like Maddie Clifton, with the potential for reform in the young offenders who commit such crimes? It's a difficult balance, and one that is still being weighed today. As we reflect on these heartbreaking and complex cases, we must acknowledge that there are no easy answers when it comes to the sentencing of juveniles who commit violent crimes. The questions raised by these cases are complex and multifaceted, forcing us to reckon with the moral, legal, and psychological aspects of juvenile justice. We must continue to ask ourselves, can children truly be rehabilitated, or are some actions beyond forgiveness? How can the justice system be both just and compassionate? Maddie Clifton's death and Joshua Phillips's conviction are not isolated events, but part of a larger ongoing conversation about youth, crime, and punishment. This story serves as a reminder of the complexities of human behavior, the impact of trauma, and the responsibility of the justice system to protect both victims and offenders, all while striving for fairness and the opportunity for redemption. We invite you to join the discussion. What do you think about juvenile sentencing. Should young offenders be given the chance to reform, or is a life sentence necessary for those who commit the most violent acts? Your thoughts and opinions matter. Let's keep this conversation respectful and productive as we seek to understand the complexities of juvenile crime and justice.